When you go to vote at the local elections in May, it won't just be posting a picture of your dog outside the polling station you'll have to think about. This time, you'll also have to remember your own photo ID. That's because for the first time in England, people will need to show that ID to cast their vote at the ballot box. Problem is, there are potentially millions of people without a valid form of ID who could be turned away on voting day. And there's not only concern that this could swing some of the results, some calling it voter suppression, there's also criticism that this is a move towards national identity cards by the back door. What's more, a lot of people aren't even aware these new rules are coming into force. Some councils, like one in South Norfolk, are using, well, let's say interesting ways to try and make communities aware.
I got something to say about May's local elections. T-Dog's spitting bars about voter ID selection, so make sure you bring it or you'll receive rejection.
The government, though, insists they're needed.
This change is important to protect the integrity of the ballot box, and we should all get ready for it in May.
But does it risk excluding some in society?
It's just another obstacle to people from underprivileged backgrounds or from marginalised communities to vote.
So why the changes? And what might it mean for democracy? I'm Sally Lockwood, and this is the Sky News Daily.
There have been a couple of pilots, but this will be the first time.
For this podcast, I'm joined by our political correspondent, Liz Bates, who's been finding out about the nuts and bolts of all this and gauging opinion.
Before that, you had to be registered, but when you turned up at a polling station, you just had to say your name and then you were able to vote. So this is a big change. It does happen already in other countries in Europe, across Northern Ireland, but for the UK, this is the first time that it will happen, and it will kick in at May's local elections.
When do people need to get their free ID online by? Because there is a deadline for that, isn't there?
Yes, the deadline is Tuesday the 25th of April at 5 p.m.
And what is accepted as a valid form of ID, Liz? Is it just passports and driving licences, or are there other things that other people could use?
It's not. There are different forms of ID that are accepted. It's a rather arbitrary list. This is one of the problems, actually, with the policy, that the government have released a list of IDs. Many of them are for older people. Things like travel cards can be used. You can find that list online. You can also apply for a free ID if you want to. Most people will use a passport or driver's license, I imagine.
How many people are there that don't have one of these valid forms of ID?
It's quite a wide-ranging estimate, but it's from around 900,000 to up to 3.5 million people could be without a valid ID. So potentially huge numbers. And I think that's really what we're going to be looking at May's local elections. What is the impact of this going to be on those elections? The government will be hoping that it's minimal. We won't know until the day after May's local elections what the impact of this is.
So, Liz, you say we won't know whether this has impacted the local election results until afterwards. Why is that?
The number of people that are actually physically turned away from a polling station, that turn up to vote, that don't have their ID, that will be counted. So we'll have a good understanding of that. There is a slight problem with that, though, because there's also an issue of turnout, because they've heard about voter ID and that it could be a problem. How many people will just decide not to turn up? And will we be able to tell from the turnout? Because turnouts fluctuate across every election. Sometimes the weather affects it, people just feeling slightly disillusioned with the political system generally. So we will know how many people get turned away. We won't know how many people just decide not to turn up.
The suggestion is that it's more likely to impact people from a deprived background or the elderly, people who don't travel and don't have a passport or don't drive a car.
If you think about it intuitively, you can bring into your mind the type of people that don't have a valid ID. Most people drive, a lot of people have passports and travel abroad. It tends to be people from deprived backgrounds, vulnerable backgrounds, very elderly people. I asked David Davis, who's a Conservative MP, about this issue. He's very much against it. And the way he breaks it down is he basically says this is punishing poor and old people.
A lot of elderly people who no longer go abroad on holiday, so they don't need a passport, no longer drive, so they don't need a driving licence, and wonder why the devil they're going to have these things. So you've got that, and also, of course, you've got poorer people, who can't afford those things either. So, are we going to actually discriminate against the old and the poor in our election system?
Basically, if you look at the groups of people that may not have ID, may not know that ID is going to be necessary or be able to access the free ID, those are the types of people that we're looking at. And if you dig into that, people from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds will be adversely affected, people on disability benefits, people who are unable to access the internet, unable to fill in the forms, things like that.
There's a suggestion, Liz, that if these people aren't eligible to vote because they don't have one of these valid forms of ID, then it could even flip councils in the local elections.
The analysis on this is not particularly detailed. There have been accusations of voter suppression, and I have spoken to Conservative MPs who believe that part of the government pushing forward this policy is because they believe that the people that don't have valid ID are mostly Labour voters, which is a very serious accusation levelled at the government if they think that this is going to keep their vote basically at the same level but suppress the opposition vote. To say that it might flip councils, it would have to really have a bigger impact than the government is expecting. But we'll have to wait and see. It is possible.
Let's turn our focus now, Liz, onto why these new rules for voter ID are even being brought in and the debate around them. They say it's to prevent voter fraud, but how much is voter fraud actually an issue?
This only addresses in-person voter fraud. So people turning up at a polling station and saying, I'm Joe Bloggs, and they're actually not Joe Bloggs, they're somebody else. And the incidence of that happening in the UK is extremely low. I think last year it was one person was eventually found to have done that. There is voter fraud in the UK. It's more subtle. It's about pressures from leaders within certain communities. It's often done via postal votes and other means. So the idea that we are addressing an actual problem of voter fraud in the UK, I don't think even the government is arguing that. I think their argument is it reduces the risk of voter fraud going forward. But as many people have said on both sides of the House, Conservative and Labour MPs, this is fixing a problem that isn't there. And I think one of the questions that hasn't really been answered by the government is when there are so many other problems that need fixing in the country urgently, why are you pushing forward a policy that is fixing a problem that doesn't exist?
Now, Liz, you travelled to Hull to speak to young people there about this issue. Why did you choose Hull, and what did they say to you about it?
Hull is lovely, but that's not why we choose to go to these places.
It was City of Culture, wasn't it?
It was City of Culture, and it's a lovely, lovely place to visit, and I enjoyed myself very much. But yes, so the reason that we chose Hull is because of the demographics of the people that will be affected by this. There are certain parts of the country that will be more affected by it because they have more of those kind of vulnerable voters in those groups that may not have voter ID, and Hull is one of those places. We spoke to a group of people that really are vulnerable to not having proper voter ID. These were young people in a community centre in Hull, and they spoke to us about the policy. Many of them had never heard of it. They raised a lot of concerns with us based on what they know about their community.
Honestly, it just seems kind of pointless. It's just another obstacle to people from underprivileged backgrounds or from marginalised communities to vote.
So in terms of the actual ID, passports and driving licenses are the main form of ID. Do you know young people in the area that wouldn't have that?
I know some people that don't have either of those, and there's been a list of other options published, but a lot of those are for the over 60s.
I think it's going to disproportionately affect disabled and trans people more than anyone else. Trans people, especially if you can't afford to renew your licence or your passport after transitioning or during transition, don't look the same as your photo. We're more likely to be challenged on our ID than anyone else.
Young people themselves are struggling with job applications and everything at the moment, so voting and trying to get a free ID is our last priority.
I didn't even know about the free ID until this morning, and I'm quite lucky to have a provisional licence, and I only got that because it was bought as a birthday present when I was 18.
Why do you think the government is doing this? They say it's to make sure there's no voting fraud. Why do you think?
If they really cared about voting as much as they say, they would listen to us when we say to them, this is not what we need. What we need is somebody who will speak for us. We need more disabled people, more trans people, more people running who were not born in this country. You know, the whole voting system is complicated within itself, never mind throwing in ID.
We have a big issue with people of our age not voting in this country because it's either inaccessible, they're not taught how, or they don't have a political system that actually represents them.
Do you think this is high up on the list of things that they should be doing?
No.
Why are we spending money on something that feels so pointless and exclusionary?
Some people might have disabilities that they can't read or write and they need help with it. Like I did once, I had to ask my nana to help me do a voting paperwork. And it's like, because I didn't know like big words or how to like fill one in. So it was like, that was my first time doing one, and ever since then I've not voted.
There's also issues with document access, internet access, secure, stable address to send that document to.
And instead of spending this money on slapping a sticker on the voting system, they could have put that same money into education to run political skills courses as a core part of secondary education.
One of the most interesting things they said to us was they were very surprised this was a government priority, given the problems that they saw around them in Hull, and it made them feel like the government doesn't care about them and that they're incredibly out of touch with what people actually need and what they care about.
How much effort has the government gone to actually publicise this change, to make sure that people are informed prior to the local elections?
Well, not much. There has been, I think, a campaign by the Electoral Commission. There's really three problems with this, and one of them is implementation and awareness. So the government, I think you could argue that they haven't done enough to make sure that people are aware of the changes and the free ID that's available. The other thing that we hear is from councils who say they haven't been given enough time and resources and guidance on how to actually implement these rules properly. Many people would like to see it scrapped, but they want to see it paused for this election because they say that people just are simply not ready. Voters and councils are not ready.
But there will be some, Liz, who say, well, is this really that big a deal? You know, you need a photo ID to get into bars, to buy alcohol, cigarettes, leave the country. What's the response to that?
That question, Sally, takes us nicely onto the bigger issue, which is this is an issue for some people of just basic freedom. Why should you be forced to have an ID card, essentially, so that you can exercise your fundamental right to vote? Now, it's very easy to make the argument, as you just did. Well, you know, lots of people there's countries across Europe doing this, Northern Ireland is doing this. You have to have ID cards for so many aspects of life. But people on the other side of the argument say, look, this is a basic right that underpins our democratic institutions. And if you take this away, then you are eroding people's civil liberties via the back door.
Now, you mentioned the Conservative MP David Davis earlier, who's clearly not a fan of all this.
We are a country that doesn't expect the government to know everything we do. You know, the rest of Europe, they have identity cards. Maybe they're comfortable with that. We are a stronger, better and freer democracy than any other country in the world. And one of the reasons is we don't have to walk around with a pass to do things.
Why do people feel so worried about this as a concept?
This has been a political debate in this country now for many years. It's hard to remember a time before we had a Conservative government, but there was a time before that. And the Blair government tried to bring in ID cards. It was Home Secretary David Blunkett that tried to push this forward. And they really wanted that to happen. At the time, it was about protecting, in a kind of world of global terrorism, it was about domestic safety. That's the issue that was happening at the time.
Yeah, because they were introduced after 9/11, right? But then they were scrapped by the successive Conservative government, if I'm not mistaken. Why was that?
Well, there was a huge backlash. If you think back to that time, it was a very live public debate. And David Davis was actually at the centre of that. He stood down as the MP in his own constituency to trigger a by-election over this issue of ID cards. There was too much, in the end, opposition in the House of Commons, and I think potentially more widely in the country. And there just wasn't the support to get it through. So it's always been an issue on the one hand of saying this, when it comes to voter ID, this is about ensuring the integrity of our electoral system. Before that, it was about safety and policing, which is why many countries across the world have ID cards. But in this country, there has always been a very vocal and in the end, very successful opposition to that, which says that this erodes our civil liberties too much. It should not be compulsory, especially to just to be able to uphold your basic rights to have an ID card. And I think that's the concern that's coming up with people like David Davis and others, which is We've had this debate already. It's already been decided.
Now, what's the government had to say about all this? What's their response to this criticism, Liz?
We don't know whether this will come in the future, but there hasn't been enough opposition ahead of this policy coming in to stop them going ahead with it. And they continue to give the same justifications that they did when they brought this policy into legislation, which is that it already happens and it's absolutely necessary to protect the integrity of our voting system. They're not prepared to bend on this. I think in the end, the crunch moment will be when we come to the local elections and we see the impact that this has had. But I do think there are really serious questions for the government to answer, because when we come to the general election, we are already having boundary changes which will favour the Conservative Party. If we also see voter suppression of Labour voters in that general election as well, and it's a very tight election, then you do have to wonder why the government are pressing ahead with these kind of reforms. This is already passed in legislation. It's going forward. It's going to happen. At the moment, it seems like we can't go backwards. The depressing thing is there's probably not going to be many people listening to this podcast that don't have the right ID. It's people that aren't engaged in the political system that will be penalised. That feels really unfair. So in terms of giving advice to people, if there are any campaigns locally to try to raise awareness of this, if you care about it, I would get involved in those.
Thanks very much indeed for all that insight, Liz. Good to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
My thanks to Liz Bates and to you for listening to the Sky News Daily with me, Sally Lockwood. This episode was produced by Annie Joyce. Our editor is Philly Beaumont.